Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 with Marisa Waxman, the City Budget Director. Ms. Waxman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the last time we spoke, you were updating us on where we were in the budget process. I believe that was back in January. So from there until now, what goes into creating the budget that was presented to City Council?
A whole lot, both the folks inside the budget office and all the city departments, and actually a lot of Philadelphians individually have been very busy in the past couple of weeks or months since January. We've done a couple of different things, starting with a lot more community engagement than we've done in the past. We held a town hall in late January with the mayor, several members of the cabinet, and close to 200 Philadelphians participated online, and we actually had translators in a number of different languages so that folks could share what they were thinking and what their needs were for the coming year. At the same time, we also held smaller focus groups, about a dozen people in each. Close to 100 Philadelphians participated in those, so we could dig a bit deeper to learn what it is that Philadelphians need, what they care about. And we tried to be very intentional about making sure that the folks who were participating in those focus groups matched the demographics of the city. Last year, we had done a survey. We got lots and lots of responses, but it didn't really look like Philadelphia as a whole. We did better this year. We tripled the share of African Americans participating in our outreach, but we're not quite there yet. And so we're going to be continuing to try and do better in coming years. We also had folks from all across the city evaluating all of the requests for new funding in terms of the impact on racial disparities. And so we worked with an outside racial equity consultant who helped evaluate departments' overall operations and approach to racial equity, as well as the specific things that they asked for new money for, graded all those in a scorecard. And that information was then provided to both the mayor's cabinet and to an entire team of folks from across city government called the Budget Equity Committee, where they then took that information and prioritized among, we've got so many needs and not enough money for everything. So we have to prioritize. And we really made sure that racial equity was front and center. And so they were slimming down and prioritizing based on what we thought what the outside consultant and others thought would move the needle the most on racial disparities. At the same time, departments were working and refining all of their requests, meeting with the Department of Revenue. We were updating our revenue estimates, working with outside economists, trying to figure out, well, how much money are we actually going to have next year? And so all of that comes together by the time we get to March 31st, which was when Mayor Kenny introduced his FY23 operating budget and capital budgets, as well as a 6-year capital program and a 5-year financial plan on the operating side. And so a lot of work, both inside and outside government, to come up with what made the most sense for Philadelphia.
Tremendous amount of work, considering how big those briefing books are. One of the key things that we discuss on the show and are very interested in is poverty. So can you tell us a little bit about how this budget addresses poverty?
It does that in a couple of different ways. And, I was just talking about racial equity and how we were prioritizing that. And unfortunately, when you look at poverty rates in Philadelphia, that's where we see some tremendous racial disparities. And so through our general investments, but also by particularly targeting those to communities of color, we are making sure that we are getting the programming where it needs to go. And, poverty on the one hand is sort of a top level, like, how much money is in pockets. And we do have programs for that where we are trying to get more money in pockets by supporting the earned income tax credit and child tax credit and helping folks apply for that. We also, though, focus on workforce development. How do we get folks jobs so that they're earning more income? We also have more investments in relief and benefit programs so that folks aren't paying out as much through the TAP program for reduced water bills. But we're also looking at what are sort of the root causes and the real challenges and what's holding our city back and why we have such high poverty rates. And so tremendous increases in education. That is a sort of foundational need. And so, we may not see all of the positive impacts overnight, but this budget includes a $14 million increase for the school district of Philadelphia to bring the annual contribution to $270 million. It includes an increase for community college, bringing the annual funding there to over $50 million. And that includes funding for the Cato Scholarship, which not only provides last dollar scholarships, but also really addresses some of the needs of Philadelphians who it's not just the scholarship dollars, but they need the wraparounds, the transportation, books, childcare, so that they can actually, follow through that and make sure that we're reducing the disparities in graduation rates from CCP. We're able to increase the number of PHL pre-K slots to 4,300. That's an increase of 300. That one starts the foundational education, of our smallest Philadelphians, but it also helps free up parents who have had childcare challenges get back into the workforce. We're in a real tight labor market right now, but we do see folks staying out of it because of childcare, because they need to take care of others. So we're making these investments in education and workforce development. And then finally, I will say that, our anti-violence challenges in Philadelphia are incredibly clear. And this budget has a 18.5% increase in our funding for anti-violence programs. And, we see such a coupling of poverty and anti-violence that it's really impossible to disaggregate the two. That was one of the best things in our community engagement sessions, was how often we heard that folks thought that everything was connected, that you couldn't talk about poverty without talking about violence, about education, about jobs. And so really, this is a pretty balanced budget that is looking at these root causes along these different streams and making sure that we're investing appropriately in improving programs in each of them.
That's correct. These things are all tied together, and this budget builds off last year by making what I think is the largest expenditure for or investment in anti-poverty program I think anyone's ever seen in the city. So it's a very positive development. But with that said, there have been some criticisms of this being a safe budget that doesn't take a lot of chances. Can you speak to that a little bit?
It's interesting. When I hear safe, when I compare it to the past two budgets that have been precarious, that have been, seen as had to reduce services and had to lay off employees, safe to me gives us a basis to actually recover. And it tells me that we're resilient, that we're rebounding, that we are making the sorts of decisions that means that we are able to maintain the day-to-day services that folks want, make sure the trash gets picked up, and as well as, like the basics, as well as really do the incredible increase in investments in anti-violence, in education. And at the same time, we are making sure that we're leveraging outside dollars, that, we only have a limited amount ourselves, and we need to take advantage of state programs. We talked about poverty, but I didn't even mention all of the housing programs. And we have our new neighborhood preservation initiative, and we have funds that we are leveraging from the state for rental assistance that are letting us do things that, frankly, city government never used to do. We're doing it creatively. We've really expanded what we do. We're also poised to take advantage of new federal dollars around infrastructure investment, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act might mean a tsunami of federal dollars coming our way, but we have to be ready to take advantage of them. That means that, this is a budget that, it's not super exciting to hear that we're going to try and get more engineers on board, but when we're able to draw down $1 billion worth of federal dollars and really transform our communities and make sure we're maintaining the infrastructure we have and upgrading it and modernizing it for the future, it's going to feel pretty transformative. Even if it seems a little boring today to realize that, what we need are architects, and we're going to need to staff up on the folks to do that construction. But we are trying to be innovative in how we're doing that, making sure that when those federal dollars come our way, it doesn't just land in the same places it always has. We want to make sure that our Black and brown businesses are benefiting from this new stream of funds into our city and region. And so, not only are we hiring those architects and engineers, but we're adding staff in our planning commission for community engagement to make sure that we understand what projects we should be developing, and adding staff in our commerce department so that they can be engaging Black and brown businesses, so that they are participating in this. So we're trying to do things differently. I don't know that I call that safe. I'd say that we are really just trying to show our resilience and rebound from a really unsafe, vulnerable position we had been in for the past 2 years.
And speaking of money from outside the city, are you anticipating any additional funding from the Commonwealth? Because they're sitting on a rather large chunk of money up there that doesn't seem to be moving anywhere. Has there been any discussion about that?
So yeah, they're obviously in the midst of their budget process as well. And there's some areas where it really makes sense, and we're hoping that we see additional funding. I mentioned rental assistance, we're hoping education. These are things that, we understand we can't do by ourselves. So we are hopeful, but obviously they're in a process as we are, but we do try and maintain conversations, budget office to budget office, obviously elected leaders to elected leaders, to try and see, what makes sense for Philadelphia as they've got dollars to spend down, because they are, as you noted, in a better position than us. Their revenues have gone up. Ours have remained somewhat vulnerable. The federal dollars we've gotten so far don't even fully replace our revenue losses. Whereas theirs, they've got federal dollars on top of tax collection gains. And so for them, they're in a different position. We're hoping that that does in some ways benefit Philadelphia.
Did the shortfalls in, by having fewer events at the convention center, fewer fans and games at the stadiums, did that create a situation where the bond repayments for those authorities are going to be affected?
So no, it doesn't, because those, when we borrow money and know that we have to take it back, that's a very serious commitment. We know that if we don't meet that commitment, folks will stop lending us money, and that's a real problem. And so Philadelphia has an agreement with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that on the convention center, we pay $15 million a year towards debt service. And that's one of our fixed costs that's sort of baked right into our budget. And in terms of the stadiums, for their debt service, that comes from the vehicle rental tax revenue stream. And that has enough money that continues to come in to cover that debt service. Where the lack of activity in our stadiums and at the convention center actually is a challenge in the city budget is the fact that we have certain taxes that, rise or fall based on how much activity there is. Our amusement tax, 85% of that comes from sales of professional sports event tickets. And so when those games aren't being played or don't have folks in the stands, that's less money. Also, what happens when you go to a game or you go to a convention? Drinking alcohol, liquor by the drink, that's money that goes directly to the school district. Our Philadelphia beverage tax, that comes in, and so it hurts our general fund and our overall collections, but the debt service for both the stadiums and the convention center is baked into our budget early, so that we don't, wobble in our commitments there.
Okay. These next two questions probably go together, albeit indirectly maybe. So how does this budget help people of color stay in their neighborhoods?
So what this budget includes, and not so much in the general fund budget, but because we've identified affordable housing as being such a priority for the city, we now have what's called the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative, which has borrowed money to do an array of affordable housing. And it's not just new housing so that folks can move in, but the most affordable housing is oftentimes keeping folks in the home they are in. So it is programs for basic systems repair and helping with retaining walls. And as well as a number of programs to help renters, either through rental assistance or support in the eviction process and counseling and diversion programs there. And so we have a number of housing programs through the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative and other ways that will help people stay in their homes, and particularly communities of color. On top of that, we continue to have a number of tax relief programs that for homeowners can be incredibly beneficial. For any old homeowner, we've got the homestead exemption, which the first $45,000 right now of your property value is tax-free. But we also have programs like the senior citizen tax freeze that for lower income seniors, when you turn 65, whatever your real estate bill is, freezes. If for some reason, your bill drops in the future, it will drop and refreeze again at the lower level, but it can never go up. We also have programs like LOOP, the Longtime Owner Occupant Program. And that's a program where if you're in a neighborhood and you've been there for 10 years and around you, the neighborhood has gentrified, the prices have gone up. And as a result, your property value is going up. If you're, and it's actually fairly generous income guidelines. If you've been there long enough, what you can do is get in the LOOP program and you'll see a reduction in your property taxes as well. So we have programs to reduce the cost of being there, help protect folks who maybe are at risk of eviction or foreclosure, programs than to just help folks maintain their homes. So, we understand very keenly that, it is far more expensive for us to serve a family in our homeless shelter system than it is to serve a family in the home they're already in. So we've got a lot of programs that we try and connect folks to help with that.
So with that said, we're looking at property assessments happening soon. I guess, so there's a couple questions here. Are those assessments, are we looking at that as a way to increase revenues in upcoming city budgets?
So the city budget that was introduced assumes 4.5% increase in assessment values. And we don't have those values yet, but it assumed 4.5%. And that, just sort of does go into the general budget because costs go up, but that's fairly modest. We know, though, that it's been a while since the properties were reassessed, and we think it's likely that the actual increase may be significantly higher than 4.5%. So for that increase, anything over 4.5%, what we're doing is we're sort of standing by and ready to work with City Council to talk about tax relief, talks about rate changes, rate reductions, and reform for any growth over that 4.5%. And so as that information becomes available and we've got sort of hard numbers to work with, then those conversations will get more meaningful about what this means, what sort of relief there will be or rate changes.
Okay, so that, and it's very early and no one's sure yet, but that could mean rebates, maybe a change in the millage rate, things like that.
Yeah, it could be trade-offs with, lowering other taxes. There's a lot of different options on the table. City Council convened a tax reform working group that has been underway looking at various options. So there's a lot of folks talking, but waiting till we get the data so we know exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. And the last thing I'd like to ask you about is about the American Recovery Plan funds, the $1.4 billion that the city received from the federal government that has to be spent down by the end of 2024. So right now, the plan is to use that money to fill existing budget holes. It comes close to doing that, about $100 million shy of doing that, but very close. However, what I'd like to ask, if we see a positive change in city revenues for any different direction, whether it be, the assessments or whatever it is, do you think that some of that money could be redirected towards anti-poverty programming, anti-violencing programming, those kinds of things?
So, absolutely. If we have more revenues than we anticipate, we'll get to make different decisions about what it is that Philadelphians need. We know that right now we're not meeting every need. It's a little bit, it doesn't really matter whether we say we're using ARP dollar, the ARP American Rescue dollars, or any other tax dollars, because they're really flexible. It's sort of like, you had a great aunt, you inherited some money from her, or you got a bonus at work. Doesn't quite matter. In your head, you might be like, oh, I'm using Aunt Gladys's money to buy a special something, and I'm using the work bonus to pay down my credit card. But really, at the end of the day, it's all the same money in your bank account. So if we get more money from tax revenues or somewhere else, it just means that we'll have more resources to do more for Philadelphians. Or, as we were just talking, or saying, what, we're going to reduce costs. There's always this trade-off. Do we want, more, pay more in, but get more services, or pay less, but maybe not get as much services? And so those are all the trade-offs that go into a budget. But certainly, if things go better than expected, that lets us make some easier choices going forward and make some new investments if that's what we think is in the best interest of the city.
All right. Marisa Waxman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.